Es ist heute der 12. Januar 2017. Das ist die Batavieren Rundfunk. And today we have as our very special guest Professor David Engels. He's a professor of Roman history at the Université Libre in Brussels, in Belgium. And he's the author of the book Auf dem Weg ins Imperium, die Krise der Europäischen Union und der Untergang der Römischen Republik. So, if I translate in English, on the road to the empire, the crisis of the European Union and the downfall of the Roman Republic.
Welcome to our podcast, Mr. Engels.
Yes, hello.
Hello. What I thought was very interesting to read, being a violinist in daily life myself, is that you started out with the wish to become a concert pianist, and then actually that road led you to the work of Spengler. Can you tell us a little about what your findings were playing the classical repertoire?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. In fact, when I played the piano, I very often was under the impression that I could really identify myself with music up to the middle, perhaps, of the 20th century, but couldn't really identify myself also with modern music. Also, when I tried to follow composition courses, also always had the impression of writing in the style of writing some kind of either neo-romantic or neo-baroque music, but in some way I had the impression that music and many other forms of art also had reached some kind of, I wouldn't say of end, but that they had perhaps gone some way even full circle, and that at the end of the atonal music you have now constructions or composers such as Arvo Pärt who go already back to a very medieval aesthetic. So it seems very interesting to me also from a historical point of view, and as I felt that I was not able to contribute to the further developing of modern art or modern music, I at least wanted to try to understand in some way what was happening and what was that very curious historical process, which is also so magnificently described in Thomas Mann's Dr. Faustus, which has led classical Occidental art in more or less 1 millennium to reach some form of end, to going back to its root, to coming full circle in some way. And I found it very interesting to try to understand what was this curious period we are living in for the moment. And so that brought me to history.
Okay, yeah, very interesting, because I always also had the idea that the Romantic era was kind of the height in music, and after that it came to sort of an end, and there were researches in lots of different directions, but it didn't really get to a point where it could go on uphill again.
Exactly.
Is that also your conclusion to this?
Yes, that's how I felt it, at least, and I'm sure that many people see that probably very differently, and that they may perhaps understand or really feel what modern atonal music is perhaps about. But I always had the impression that there is some kind of mist linked with the general population, with a general, genuine human feeling of what is beautiful, what is pleasing in some way, also in the domain of music, and that however I saw these facts, that there was an interesting and important moment in the history, not only of art but also of European history itself, that is happening right now, and that brought me also to be more and more interested in the work of Oswald Spengler. You already mentioned, many people only remember the world of the decline of the West as his main idea, but what Spengler really tried to show is that the history of the West, of the last millennium of European history, is in fact very parallel, very in analogy to the history of half a dozen of other cultures, societies in human history, such as the Chinese history, such as Greco-Roman history, or Indian history, or Muslim history, who all go through quite similar moments of evolution, now at different periods of course, and and who all have also, as a living being, achieve a final state of their final phase of their evolution. I had the impression, as did Spengler also, that we came more or less to to such a moment in European history, and recent events also in Europe, I think, have shown to many people that this impression of living at a crucial moment of our evolution is in fact absolutely justified.
Yes, so actually the vision of cultures going more in cycles, like a human life, that they have a birth and development and then a death, versus the more Christian, I think, vision about things that develop on and on and on until
progressively better and better.
Yeah. And of course, Christian view, which is based on a large human scale of evolution, whereas for Spengler and of course many other philosophers of history, there isn't really any evolution or historical evolution of humanity as such, but rather an evolution of different cultures, everyone behaving in a similar way, but without giving a general teleological aim to human history as such from the beginning. And so, Spengler found that theory very attractive. Now there are, of course, a lot of scholarly problems also attached to that theory, but it seems to me an interesting hypothesis to start also my own reflections, and that brought me then to the idea of comparing at least a sample of today's history to the history of other cultures in order to really to show if it worked or if it didn't work.
Okay. You're talking about the European Union and its crisis. What would your short definition be of the current crisis? What makes it a crisis in your eyes?
Good question. I would say in a medical term, even the use of the word of crisis is perhaps not even thus appropriated, because normally in a medical term, crisis is the moment where you have the choice between two alternatives. Either the patient dies in some way, or at least becomes even worse, or to the contrary, he recovers. That is the general idea of crisis, as from the Greek word krisis. And I would even say that European society is not even at a moment of crisis. It is at a moment where very obviously we are living in the middle of huge social, cultural, political, religious transformations, which I would consider as being parallel to what happened in the late Roman Republic, that is the end of the 1st century BC, where Rome saw a lot of very similar moments of societal crisis, which led ultimately to civil warfare, or at least civil unrest, economic decline, and then at the end the rise of a more or less authoritarian state. And I think that is more or less the moment where we are, and the term of crisis would perhaps apply to the fact that we are not really sure if the outbreak of these events will happen this year or next year or perhaps in 10 years, but I do not doubt that it will happen. And it is a bit it is in that perspective that I would use the word crisis. We cannot know exactly when it will really start to show off that clearly, but I'm convinced by the analogies with the late Roman Republic and also other periods that it is quite inevitable, at least in the nearer future.
Yeah, so we are beyond the point of no return, and we currently see the downfall of the European Union, at least, and maybe even European culture in a broader sense.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we will see the downfall of the European Union as such. Perhaps we will even assist to the transformation of the European Union into a form of even much more centralized and authoritarian state. But in some way it will be the downfall of the traditional model of a open, egalitarian, liberal, tolerant society after the model of the political paradigm of the 1950s, 1960s. We are still in some way trying to hold up. We are still living in this kind of post-war ideology and experience, now it becomes more and more obvious that this is a general ideological superstructure which has ceased to correspond to what is really happening in its interior. And that's why I think that this changing of paradigm, where we will at least again start to adopt a new worldview which corresponds to what has happened for the last 10 or 20 years, might happen quite soon, but as all changes of paradigm will not happen in a peaceful and easy way, but will need much blood and tears in some way to be accepted by everyone, unfortunately.
Yeah, and to make things clear for the listener, because not everyone is acquainted very well with the Roman history, also currently there are made a lot of analogies between the downfall of Europe and the downfall of the Roman Empire, but you are specifically talking about the Roman Republic, which is the phase before the Empire.
Absolutely. That's an error which is also made, unfortunately, quite often in the media, because people do not really realize that I'm speaking about the Republic, though I'm saying it quite clearly, and that is even not on the cover page of the book. But indeed, many people, when they read the title of my book and the general summary, think that I'm one more of these many people who are parallelizing the crisis of the European or Western society with the downfall of the Roman Empire in the 4th, 5th century AD. And who are trying to parallelize the migrant crisis with the German barbarians and the end of democratic structures with the end of the Roman Empire. But as you said, it's not the 4th or 5th century, which seems the right moment to be compared with. I really see analogies with the late Roman Republic in the 1st century BC, which is roughly the period extending from, I would say, from the period of the Gracchi through people like Marius, like Sylla, like Pompey, like Cicero, like Catilina, like Caesar, up to Mark Antony and Augustus. This period many people know, perhaps still a bit from their Roman history, seems to be, to me at least, what is most similar to our people, our period now.
Yeah, because the dividing line between a republic and empire is the death of Caesar and the power of Augustus, who became the first emperor of the Roman Empire. Could you maybe give a very short summary of the most important things that happened in that period?
Sure. It is of course a very complex period, like our period also, and where it is very difficult to draw very neat lines when one thing starts, the other finish. Many people already see the beginning of the downfall of the Republic at the end of the 2nd century, or with events like the siege and capture of the city of Rome by Sulla. Others insist on the fact that even Augustus in some way is still functioning, or the state of Augustus is still functioning in a large continuity with Republican structure. So it is a very complex and a very fluid period. But I would say, to summarize in some words, not necessarily the political events, but the structural events or structural tendencies which are behind. We see that the crisis extends on many levels of the late Roman Republic. We have, of course, a political crisis which is linked to the fact that there is a rift which becomes larger and larger between the senatorial oligarchy, which becomes more and more disconnected to the people, and the simple people who feel that their wishes, their problems are not anymore respected by their politicians in some way, and who turn more or less to so-called populares, we would say populist politicians, and an antagonism which becomes, of course, much and more difficult by the fact that many of these politicians also control in the provinces large armies, so that political disputes become quite quickly also military conflicts. But there's, of course, much more also. It's not only a question of a simple political transformation of a city-state administration into a real imperial state, as directed by Augustus as first emperor, and the possibility of putting into reality large term and mostly longue durée reforms of the state. There are also many other aspects. It's an identity crisis. The Roman religion is in a form of crisis. The Roman demography, or the demography of the Greek and Roman people is also declining. We have a transition in terms of family image, in terms of also a more moral worldview. We have a first form also of globalization. So there are many aspects, of course, to all this. There's, of course, also the economical transition, where the Roman economy becomes more and more financialized, where there is financial speculation, where people gain enormous riches in some years only, whereas the simple people become more and more poor, workless, etc. So there are many features, I would say, which resemble, of course, aspects of modern day life, and that is also something that has led me to imagine that our current European identity or cultural crisis is inevitable in its outcome. It is so large, and it plays on so many fields also of cultural evolution, exactly as in the late Roman Republic, that I cannot quite see how we can avoid a parallel outcome also, which is, of course, the transition through a phase of civil unrest into an authoritarian state. So that is broadly the idea.
Yeah, maybe later on we can talk to, maybe let's call them your future visions, so to say. You structured your book in 12 themes to analyze the current European situation, and to also make the analogy with the Roman Republic at that time, and also to show you what these problems are and what in the end the effects of these problems will become. You started with the subject of ethnicity and cosmopolitanism, and I think that is maybe one of the most important themes at this moment, especially because of the huge migrant streams we saw the last 2 years coming towards Europe. Maybe you can talk about that. What problems do you see there happening in Europe?
Yeah, with the migration crisis, of course, we are in the big middle of the problem. Now, it is in some way very curious that this migration problem is so in the middle of general discussion, because there are, of course, issues which are, I would say, much more important for the long-term development of European people than the migration crisis, which has become so important in the view of many people, because they are, I would say, they mirror in some way all other conflicts, all other problems of European society. In Rome, we see that at the end of the second and mostly in the first century BC, we have also a huge phenomenon of influx of people coming mostly from the Eastern Mediterranean towards Rome, but also to other big metropolises of the Roman Empire. Because they are looking for jobs, they are looking also for the very rudimentary social security, of course, the Roman Republic can offer to its citizens. They are looking for adventure, they are looking for a modern way of life. So it's quite analogous, of course, to the migration we have had to Europe, not only in the last 2 or 3 years, but for 50 years, for 2 or perhaps sometimes even 3 generations. And the reactions of the people are also quite the same. You have, on the one hand, you have people like Cicero or many others who are saying, well, it is our humanitarian duty to welcome these people. Now we shouldn't make them necessarily immediately Roman citizen. So there is a form of openness, of tolerance. But you also have, on the other hand, many simple people who are saying, well, we are already so poor now, we don't have any jobs, we are already living under very dreary conditions here in these huge cities like Rome, where 1 million of people is condensed on only some square kilometers in huge buildings which are falling apart and so on. So very similar conditions to what you have in the outskirts of London or Paris or Berlin, and who are saying, well, there are too many of these foreigners, we have to expulse them. And so there have been laws even passed sometimes by you would say so-called populist politicians expulsing regularly these strangers, but they always come back some years after. So there is a rising xenophobia, which also gives place to conflicts between population groups and so on, until the age, of course, of Augustus, where a solution is found through a new definition of what it means to be Roman, and where the very cosmopolitan, multicultural, tolerant attitudes you could find in Hellenistic philosophy, which you find today in politically correct media, is replaced by a much more traditional, historical point of view, where Romanness is perhaps not anymore linked to the ethnicity, but at least to the adherence to a certain number of valor, of traditions, of values, of historical guidelines. So already there, in this point, it is obvious how similar today's debate and the first century BC can be interpreted.
It reminds me very much of the difference between Pegida in Germany on the one hand, so they're rejecting migrants, and on the other hand, people welcoming migrants on a train station in Bayern. Yeah. It's exactly the same difference in reaction that you're describing in the Roman Republic.
Yeah, and what I was also wondering is that the last years you see that economically the middle class is kind of disappearing. So there is perhaps an elite who have money and who live in good neighborhoods and who actually mostly see the benefits of immigration, for example, expats that they work with, or their Thai babysitter, or etc. And on the other hand, there are the more the populace, perhaps, the people that get economically weaker and that have mainly negative effects from the immigration, because their neighborhood goes down and they experience criminality, they don't dare to be on the streets late at night. Is this disappearance of the middle class also something that was in the Roman Empire at that age?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen the 2nd and 1st century BC also the disappearance of solid middle class, generally artisan or farmer class in Italy. That started already at the end of the Second Punic War, where much parts of Italy are devastated by Hannibal and so on, and there's some rich people jump on the opportunity of buying large parts of Italy which are more or less without value after all these years of war. And so we have also in Rome what we call latifundia, which are large agricultural domains which are labored by slaves or by very poorly paid people. So we see really the rise of some kind of proletariat, if you wish, who reacts also against the rich people through slave wars like Spartacus, for example. So that's very similar also to the social contests we had in the 20th century. And so also in the city of Rome, the middle class is slowly disappearing. We see that through the census lists of Rome. It becomes more or less impossible for the Roman army to recruit citizens able to pay for their own equipment. So the army has also to be professionalized, because there aren't enough people to come, as I said, with their costly equipment. So that's quite similar. And of course, the whole migration migration crisis is in some way today, as in the past, also instrumentalized and becomes also a big factor of ideological contest, because on the one hand you see that many of the autochthonous Europeans reproach their elites of becoming disconnected with their own history and feel as if they were now the only guarants of European identity on the one hand, and you see quite curiously on the other hand that many or at least significant parts of migrants don't feel really at home also in this modern Europe, and that generally the criticism of many fundamentalist Islamic immigrants or people are very similar in some way to criticism by conservative populistic parties in Europe. Both are directed against a very materialistic, very globalized, very technicized, very deconnected establishment with a liberal or ultra-liberal and politically correct attitude. And it is an irony of history in many parts to see that conservative or so-called populist Europeans spend more time with fighting the fundamentalist Muslims, who very often draw at least or start from the same social analysis, then directing their attention finally against the political system, which makes this happen. Of course, there are fundamental differences between them both, because up to now, at least, there aren't every day some suicide attacks by populist leaders or populist voters throughout Europe. But it is interesting to see that the social analysis is paradoxically very clear and very parallel, and that resembles also the late Roman Republic, where on the one hand you see an attitude towards Hellenistic, liberal, tolerant philosophy, which becomes more and more concerned with the downfall of old values. You find in nearly every Roman or Greek author of the end of the first century allusions to this moral decline. And on the other hand, you see that many of the new people arriving at Rome, but also in many other cities of the Roman Empire, who pledge their loyalty to what is called Oriental cults, such as Isis and Osiris, or Cybele, or Judaism, or even Christianity, also start from a very similar outlook, but of course with very different conclusions. But I think that is already the section about Roman religion we will certainly come back to in our discussion, I believe.
Yeah, because the commonality, also maybe why a lot of Muslims go on and become extremists, is that we as a culture, we cannot offer them something else in return, because we have diluted our own culture, because and we also see it in the Roman Republic, with the expansion of the Roman, well, not empire, but the Roman Republic. Of course, a lot of new people came in, and we all those people wanted to have the rights of the Roman citizens themselves. So we saw that the definition of what it was to be a Roman person, a Roman citizen, it became broadened. So in the end, it became so diluted that we all fell back on what you call universalistic, cosmopolitic identity, which is not really an identity. Maybe you can say something more about that.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. I think that is another important topic where the parallels are evident between both societies. The question of identity is very crucial to all this, and as you said, when the Roman Empire of the Republic encompassed also the Greek territories. There has been a big influence of Hellenistic philosophy of what it meant to be a citizen, which has given rise to the image of the cosmopolitan citizen who is proud of being civilized, but who is not anymore defined by his allegiance to a specific form of history, of religion, of cult, of language. And it is only at the end of the Republic and at the beginning of the Principate that in some way the Romans managed to construct quite artificially some pseudo-traditional return to an old identity, but which at least was open enough to enable people coming from other cultural backgrounds to become integrated into this society. And that is quite in analogy to what you also said about the migrant crisis. Our European identity, which has such a long time been based on, for example, Christian religion, of a certain form of social interaction, of a certain loyalty to our own history, and a certain pride perhaps also in our past, has largely disappeared. And I mean, we shouldn't really blame the migrants of not becoming the Europeans we ourselves seem to have stopped to wanting to be. And it is curious also to see that many, even fundamentalist Muslims can feel much more at ease when talking and interacting with Christians, believing Christians who are also believing in one God, in one specific form of religion, because at least they are talking on the same basis. Of course, the one and the other are convinced that the religion of the other isn't quite the true religion, but at least there is some form of common understanding. But in Muslim law, being a Christian is of course not that great, but at least it's tolerated. But in Muslim law, being an atheist is something which is only which merits the death penalty. So that explains, of course, also their difficulty with dealing with a totally tolerant, liberal, open, capitalized, globalized society. They really can't make their place in it, and which forces them in some way to become more and more exclusive in order to keep to their identity and not to become as diluted as many Europeans have become in the meantime.
Maybe it's also a lack of respect they have for Western society, because they as a religion or as a culture know what they're standing for, but we do not.
Yeah.
And maybe that's also why they call us sometimes the decadent West, where everything is possible and there seems to be no more rules anymore we have to adhere to.
Yeah, most certainly. I would even say that fundamentalist Islam is, at least in my view, not a phenomenon of the Muslim world, but it is a symptom of the Western world. I think that without Western colonization, but also with the disinterest in the political well-being of the Muslim world, and the continuation of the economic exploitation of the natural resources of the Near East, without all these interference, I don't think that Islam would have become a threat to any other cultures. It is only with its integration into the Western world that it has become a factor of Western history. And I see modern Islamic fundamentalism in the immediate continuity of, for example, communist or anarchistic terrorism in the 1950s or 1960s. Young European people who didn't feel at ease in the Western world, who criticized capitalism, the loss of values, of any moral standing, turned to a ideology who explained more or less everything in a coherent way and tried to change things. in the 50s or 60s, they did it by believing in Marx and Engels, and now it is by adopting the certain interpretation of the Quran, and of course of linking back again to the past of many of the second or third generation migrants. But for me, it's that point of view which seems the most convincing, and which shows that the problem of fundamentalism hasn't been imported here. It stems from our own inner identity crisis, and fundamentalism, Muslim fundamentalism, can only be solved as a problem if we solve our European identity problem first.
Yeah, because I think there are little people who can live according to the cosmopolitical ideal of being 100% individualistic, having values, a value system that you kind of make up your own, instead of the clarity perhaps, or the identity that comes from a strong culture or a strong religion, or a combination of both. So there is an ideal, seems to be an ideal of a cosmopolitical image, but there are not many people who can live with that or something. So
it's
even
too,
European...
It's too general, you also describe in your book. It's so general that no one can feel connected to it. Like you give as an example the preamble to the Treaty of Lisbon. So it's the follow-up of the Constitution of 2005, European Constitution, which was officially not accepted, which was about, we as Europe, we stand for equality, liberty, and some other general values, but without explaining something about our own culture, about what we think is important. It has become too diluted, our culture.
Yeah, I would say so. There are perhaps two aspects to that. On the one hand, of course, it is I believe much more easy to be a tolerant, liberal, cosmopolitical individual if you already have your job, if you have a nice income, if you live in a nice neighborhood, then it's of course very, 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 very easy to be like to feel good about being politically correct and of being on that side. But I believe that it is much more difficult of believing into the rightness also of only the ideals of political correctness if you don't have any job, if you don't have any formation, if you see that you have despite all these promises of freedom, of equality, of progress for everyone, if you see that in reality you don't have any chances of one day ascending the social ladder because you have your huge money you are owing to the banks, you don't have any job, you have many children, you have to deal with, you are in a neighborhood where nothing functions, you are exploited by other people, and then of course it becomes very difficult to assume why a society who can't deal with its growing problem of unemployment needs to import even millions more of people from other countries who are not necessarily all extremely gifted, and who aren't, I believe, all either medicines or engineers or highly qualified technicians. So I think there is of course a social aspect to that problem of why some people feel so akin to politically correct ideals, and others simply don't see the point. On the second point I would like to mention is the fact that of course these universalistic values of equality, of freedom, of democracy, etc. They are of course crucial for our society. They should be crucial for every society. They should be the most important values. That is quite clear. My criticism is the fact that only these values, that these values can function as only social cement of a society in a world state. But on the simple base of Europe, it is impossible to explain, for example, to a German, why he should feel solidarity with someone from Greece, for example, only on this basis. on the basis that he should respect equality, freedom, democracy, liberalism, and so on, because these values they apply to everyone. And so a German or people from Denmark could rightly ask, well, why should I feel then, if my main identity is only these based on these universalistic values, why then should I pay more for someone from a ruined country from the south of Europe, and not also the same amount of money to people in India, in Korea, in Africa? What is the point of feeling solidarity? And as of course they can't pay for everyone on the earth, they do not want to pay for anyone at all. That is of course the sad conclusion. And that is the reason why I think that what is missing in the European Constitution, or at least the European treaties and also European politics, is also the allegiance not only to human values in general, that's normally the United Nations who care about that, but also to what makes us European as European, and what explains why we should feel first solidarity with other Europeans, and why the German taxpayer should think it as his duty to pay money also to the people from Greece and not from India. And that can only function on the basis if you explain what makes both belonging to the same group, which cannot be humanity as such, but which has to be a group identical with what we would call European culture. And this definition of what makes us European is totally missing in European politics.
So I might summarize by saying that democracy, equality, freedom are more the general conditions we have to live under. They are not our culture. Yeah. That's the big mistake we are making here.
Exactly. These values are also do apply to the United States. They apply to Japan. They apply to South Korea. So we need another sample, another set also of values, or at least of reference points, of knowing what it is to be European, and what are the limits also of Europe, and what are the cardinal points which should constitute this identity and enable other people to integrate by defining themselves in front of these points.
Do you think this is possible, to create this European identity and to convince the general public of that they actually feel identified with other Europeans? Is this something that is an ideal, or is this really something that can be realized?
Yeah, that's a very important question, where I have of course to say first that I, as a historian, propose rather the analysis of facts and not necessarily possibilities of altering them. And I also have to say that personally I'm quite deterministic in my outlook on history, so I don't even think that we have large possibilities of changing our politics. The analogies with the fall of the Roman Republic seem so obvious to me that I don't think we have a large choice between many options. I think history will go more or less the same way. And if we look at least how it has how things have evolved in Rome, where there has been also very similar identity crisis of what it meant or not to be Roman, we see that first, of course, there has been this difficult period of inner unrest, where the Republic has been more or less become ineffective because of the rise of populism, and where there has been a mounting tension. And I would say that is more or less what we are now starting since the elections of 2016 and the forthcoming elections now. Then there has been a period of huge civil unrest, even civil warfare. I think that might happen also, where these different understandings of what it means to be Roman and what politics should be about will enter a violent clash, which can last for perhaps a decade or two. And then a third phase is under Augustus, and which might happen perhaps in one generation in Europe, where we will have the rise of an authoritarian state, which then will redefine political or cultural identity in a way where on the one hand Roman identity is reinvented through references to the mythical past, to the Roman Republic, to the great examples of Roman politics, to the old moral values of the forefathers, and on the other hand is defined in such a broad and artificial way that it becomes possible also for people from Greece and then from Syria, from Spain, from Egypt to adhere to these values, to try to identify with them. Of course, they do not really manage that always in the first generation, but at least they try, and then you see that from generation to generation they become assimilated. And to ask your questions, if it is possible to construct a European identity, I would say that identities can never really be artificially constructed. I'm a firm believer in the fact that there is a European identity. There's always been a European identity, at least for the last millennium. There still is one. It's only the fact that we do not really want to see it. Or at least that our politicians do not want to see it as it is. It is difficult, of course, to define what it means to be a European, but if you look, for example, to people living in India, it is very difficult for them also to define what it means to be an Indian. They do not share the same language, they do not always share even the same religion, they do not always share the same customs, but they are, of course, they belong together in some way. They partake in a large number of very difficult aspects, which makes them a unique culture, exactly as the Muslim culture, exactly as the Chinese culture. And for me, there is also a European culture, and everyone who doesn't really, who feels frustrated by the fact that it is impossible to define it in 2 or 3 words, simply has to take, in my view, a plane and to travel to Beijing or to travel to Cairo with some other Europeans from other countries, and then they will immediately feel what it is of being European, because they will feel their belonging together as being still closer than the other. And that's, I think, identity. Identity is our history, is our shared past, is our shared religion, even if we do not necessarily find that this history is great or that we still adhere to Christianity, but it has formed us, it has formed our past. We are still thinking in these categories, and we should accept that even when we reject them, they are crucial to the structuring of our being. That is for me identity.
Might you still give it a try to summarize in maybe a few sentences what you think is maybe a typical European, if there was one? What makes the most Europeans, for example, different from Americans or different from Africans? Maybe you can give some examples?
Yeah, that's of course extremely difficult. I would say that the Americans, at least the people from North America, for me, belong also to the same idea of Western culture. Mm-hmm. I would say that the European culture is the basis and the nucleus of the Western civilization. For me, at least North America and, for example, Australia belong to the same culture. Of course, there are some characteristic differences, but I think that the differences between a Canadian and an Englishman are much lesser than between an Englishman and, say, for example, a Russian. So for me, there is one Western culture. Would even count the North America to that. I do not know very well South America, so I wouldn't venture to speak about them. And if you're asked for some characteristic salient points of views, I would perhaps revert to the old idea of the Faustian man, this old concept of Faust, this important semi-mythological person from the late Middle Ages, of being the perfect paradigm of what the West is about. The West is generally this tendency to go higher, farther, faster, to exceed limits in all their extremes. There's some kind of expansive positive nature of inherent tendency to the progress with all its advantages, because most parts of modern technologies are due to the European culture, but also, of course, in its very black sides. When the European culture errs, it errs fundamentally, as we have seen in the 20th century with the horrible events of the as well fascistic as communist totalitarianism. I would say that is something that is perhaps not so much shared by other cultures who do not have this inherent instinct of exceeding limits, of being higher. This feeling you see in a Gothic cathedral, where you are really pushed upwards by this kind of architecture, which you have also in classical music, which has this kind of space filling impetus to it. You see, for example, in the Greco-Roman culture, doesn't have at all this tendency towards progress. It is a very stable, even static cultures, much more interested by things like form, like sculpture, like description of forms of bodies, for example, than the Faustian or European man who tries to understand how it functions from the inside, and how you can make it even faster and go beyond the limits. Or, for example, the Chinese, who are much more interested, I would say, in social harmony without any form of metaphysical speculation, for example. So I would say every human culture has its specific form of identity which permeates all its creations in culture, in politics, in philosophy, and it's very difficult to define them, but yet they are there. They can be felt, but of course also they only have a limited time of living, and that's also what I'm still wondering, how many people in Europe are still sharing that common impetus.
Yeah, and I was also wondering in this that identity is clearly something that goes beneath everything, that kind of exists there if we see it or not. The general values that you mentioned that are important in many cultures, the democracy and the freedom and the equality, are actually things that we consider to be we assume them to be important, but as you spoke about the perhaps lower class at the moment in Europe, who are mostly worried about the safety in the neighborhood, if they can keep their job, if they can feed their children, etc. Do they really care about these values? Aren't these values becoming more relative? Do they really find democracy, for example, important?
Yeah, unfortunately, that's also a big issue, and it was also at the end of the late Roman Republic. It is really a pity to see that 2000 years ago, as today, to most people, these values have become obsolete, because they still exist, but they are not anymore filled with any sense, at least in the eyes of people. Of course, democracy is and will always remain, I believe, I hope so, an important ideal. But if you ask people in Europe, in Eurobarometer statistics, for example, you see that a vast majority of people in Europe has the impression that his or their vote, their political vote, doesn't count anymore. They don't have any confidence also anymore in most democratic institutions. I think that in the last Eurobarometer, the confidence into the national parliaments was only around 23%. So that doesn't mean that the idea of parliamentarism is false, but it means that the general adherence to the concrete form of democracy is dramatically sinking. And so that is why I fear that if things continue like now, that people will have so big issues already with everyday life, with as you said, being sure to have a job, or at least social security, and of not being robbed when it's dark outside, and to have their children more or less in a normal condition with some social chances, that they will eagerly and very easily abandon these general values who do not represent anything for them anymore, if at least they can have some basic elements like income, like security, like order, and that their vote and the fact that there is a democratic structure is not really any important point for them anymore. I mean, if you are at the limit of or well beyond the limit of poverty, you stop to care simply for democratic structures. You simply want to survive, and if you see that with democratic structures, you cannot survive, you vote for a populist or authoritarian party if it can assure you that survival, and you will care about their democratic nature afterwards once you have again enough to eat. And that's what happened also in the late Roman Republic. People abandoned their vote, they abandoned their liberty because quite simply they wanted to survive, they wanted to have these horrible civil wars stopped, they wanted to have at least order, to have security, to be sure not to die anymore in social conflicts or in wars, and they didn't care anymore about the institutions of a republic, which was ineffective in assuring the most daily problems of their life. And I fear that is exactly what is starting to happen now, not only in Europe but also in the USA, that social and economic issues are becoming so big that the problems of values and of democracy cease to be very important for people, and are even associated to a political elite which has failed to succeed.
Yeah, and I wonder even if the problems that we currently have can be solved by democracy. Like you mentioned, the European identity, to establish that, or it exists, but to acknowledge it, to protect it, perhaps. Are the problems of today things that can be solved in a democratic way? Like, for example, in the book you mentioned the state form of Augustinus, that it was a mix of aristocracy, monarchy, and democracy. Mm-hmm. Is our current state form fit to solve our current problems?
I fear that no. I fear no. Our institutions in Europe have been fundamentally designed by the political situation of the 1950s, 1960s, where on the one hand prosperity was assured through the necessity of reconstructing Europe after the war. So even if politicians decided something very dumb, there was the trend was upward anyway, and there was such a political stability because of the fear of the nuclear war that there wasn't really any interstate politics, because we had these two blocks. So you couldn't really go wrong. So we constructed a very complicated system of democracy, which was admirably designed for the situation of the 1950s, 1960s, but which is failing now today, where very clearly prosperity and growth have ceased to be as sure as they were before, and where we really need to have a very clear and strategic foreign policy. And Rome had more or less the same problem. It lived also in republican structures, which came from the 2nd century BC, and which were not anymore adapted to the very complicated system of the 1st century, with many social wars, with its uprisings, with the necessity of governing this immense empire, of presenting also Rome towards its most important foe, the Parthian Empire, where they also needed a common guideline in order to assure their survival. And that's why also the late Roman Republic failed, exactly as the modern democratic state is unfortunately failing. We have so many levels of democratic control that the political reforms we need so so I would say so urgently cannot be realized in any way. I mean, in order to help us to fight as well the problem of unemployment, of demographic decline, of globalization, of a ultraliberalism, of technocracy, of disindustrialization, of the fact that people become older and older, that social costs are rising. All these problems, in order to be solved, would need a big political master plan designed for 10, if not 20 years, and which would need to be pushed through from the beginning to the end without going astray to the left or the right, and which would, at least at the beginning, impose enormous costs on us all, and would reform completely our society. And such a reform, which would be the only way for us to stabilize again Europe, can of course not be realized through a democratic government where you have ever-changing majorities on the communal, the regional, the federal, the national, the European level, and where there is this big contest, of course, between all political parties, and I see I do not see any possibility of seeing on every level of European politics a consensus of all political parties for 10 up to 20 years to keep to a common guideline. I don't see that. And if they would really manage to have such an agreement, it would cease to be a democracy anyway.
Yeah. So
in the one or the other hand, either through consensus or through submission to a form of military government, the outcome would be the same. And that's what happened in Rome, and I fear that it will happen to Europe, and I even fear that there is no alternative to it, and that we have to accept it without deploring it, if you guess my meaning.
I have one more big theme that we haven't really talked about yet. But first, when I read your book, I was surprised about how actual it seemed, although it has been written a few years ago. So it was written before the huge migrant streams coming to Germany, like 1 million in 2015, huge amounts of migrants. One of the arguments for the German government was that we needed the migrants because we have a diminishing population in Germany, which was also connected in your book with the problem, diminishing population, and also the changing roles of husband and wife, males and females in our society. Could you tell a little bit more about that and how it also went in Rome?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we see in the late Roman Republic also a very different approach to family life. We see that divorce is exploding, we see recomposed families, we see of course also this dwindling demography where at the end it becomes very, very difficult also to have levies for the Roman army, and where the number of citizens is shrinking. And what is so interesting in that fact is that generally in Europe this evolution has been ascribed to the availability of methods of birth control, etc. Whereas in Rome there has been no such revolution. The possibilities were always the same, more or less, of showing abortion and things like that, but the readiness to adopt it increased. So that shows very, very clear that what is happening today is not a fruit of technological or medical progress, but is rooted in our different understanding of society. Today, many people are fundamentally influenced by individualism, by materialism, by some form of egoism also in dealing with others. They do not want to find a lifelong compromise with another human being as husband or as wife. They do not want to invest their time into the the raising of children. They do not want necessarily to be integrated into their social surrounding, and it is obvious that the result of all that is also a decline in demographics, and that happens also in the late Roman Republic, and that is also why, of course, the idea of addressing that problem through the import of new human beings is at the same time very, very, very silly, because it doesn't really attack the main problem of missing new people or missing new generations, but only cures the symptom,
or
and
even aggravating the problem.
Perhaps even aggravating it.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I find that this approach is totally and unacceptably cynical, because importing human beings, importing people by saying, we don't have enough, so we are importing them, like we need some more bananas, or we need some more oil, for example, or everything. So I find this attitude very typical for our modern, very materialistic approach also to what it means. So yes, the state needs 80 million to be run, so we do not have anymore, so we take them from everywhere. The state has ceased to be a community which has a common identity, but only a machine that needs to be run, and if some wheels are falling apart, we do not ask why everything falls apart, we take them from simply another machine.
But also accepting that by increasing amounts of immigrants, that your own culture has to diminish, because there are fewer people left, you have to give in to the customs of new people. So it's almost like a conscious decision to get rid of your own culture, which is also called oikophobie, for example, by Thierry Baudet in Holland.
Yeah, I would say there are two aspects to that. Of course, I would say on the one hand, importing new people in large masses, like it is happening, like it is happening now, does not necessarily mean that our own culture will be diluted, because if you look at the proportions, it is still so that in Europe the vast majority of people is also ethnically European. I would say the main problem is about integration, and there have always been in Europe and throughout human history big migration movements, where sometimes large immigration movements have been very well integrated and dealt with, and sometimes very small movements have led to big problems. So it's less about numbers and figures, but rather about the attitude. If the European culture would be strong enough to stand its ground, to be proud about its own history, to not necessarily to impose its culture on other people, but on saying we are defining the framework, we are defining to what different aspects you should align yourself, then it would be, I think, much less of a problem. And that's, I think, the basic problem, that we lost this ability, or perhaps also the wish, of making our own civilization survive. There is indeed this hatred in some way of our own culture, which is of course also historically understandably, if you think again about, of course, the atrocities of colonialism, about the world wars, about the Holocaust. So it's sure that we cannot be proud about everything in European history. So it's quite normal that there has been this opposite evolution. But this evolution has attained such an extreme now that it is some kind of cultural suicide. When I see people going through the street with slogans such as "Nie wieder Deutschland," never again Germany. German people who are going through the street and proud about hating their own nation or their own culture, then it is a real identity problem, and it is that aspect that has to be addressed, and which was also a problem in the late Roman Republic. There has not been necessarily this kind of guilt about its own history. I think that's quite unique in European history. Now there have also been large discussion in the Senate, in the Roman elite about to what extent the Roman Empire was also morally justified, and to what the fact that it was built on wars was not an important aspect of claiming that it should be dismantled. There have been this kind of discussions, but what is even more interesting is that we have the quotations by Cicero, for example, who says how terrible it is that in his own time one goes through the city of Rome, and I quote him more or less, that he says that we do not know the name of our gods anymore, we do not understand anymore our institutions, we have lost the significance of our language, and he says we are going through the streets of our own town like strangers who do not know it anymore. And I think that is exactly what is happening now. The European people feel disconnected to their own history. They do not know anymore what it means to be European, and even more so, many of them are even hating their own culture. I had once the very curious experience of being at a book fair in I think it was in Leipzig. And I was talking with a German lady who said to me when she heard that I had children that she would never have any children because there have been such atrocities committed by European people that it is only right if our own culture would disappear in order to atone for all the crimes we have committed, that it is a good thing
Inherited
that there are
guilt.
not anymore any children.
Yeah.
And I think that, of course, I hope that attitude is concerns only a minority, but it is very telling, and that is, of course, the main problem I think that European politicians should address. And I think that if at last a majority of European feels again more or less close or in adequation with its own past and its identity, then I think that things like the migration crisis or like fundamentalism would be only a very secondary aspect of everyday life. It has become so important because it reflects an identity problem, which is the real problem at the root. What we need is an intellectual, an identity revolution in Europe, not necessarily a new social or a new political order, I think.
We have to look at the time because good conversations always take a lot of time. We experience with our podcast.
Sure.
I have one more last question. We already referenced to a possible future for Europe with a more authoritarian, conservative leader, people willing to give up freedoms for that. But that's still a little bit vague, in my opinion. Maybe could you give us some thoughts about what the practical consequences would be for the coming 10, 20 years that people will notice in daily life about the thing that you think will happen in Europe?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's difficult, of course, to play the prophet, huh?
Mm-hmm.
But
just wild speculations, of course.
But on the basis of what happened in Rome, I would say that populism that is happening now is the equivalent to the social unrest you had in Rome between the optimates, the populares, between Claudius, Milo, these people. This will very clearly make any long-term European politics impossible. So the actual economical, cultural, political, social crisis will become ever more important in the next year, up to the moment when we have the beginning of civil unrest everywhere throughout Europe. That may take 10, 20 years and can be quite there might be much bloodshed, I fear.
But what do you think will happen? Will there be riots, or will there really be battles between groups of
Riots,
people?
I would say. Because to the difference to the Roman Republic, our society is not, perhaps not yet, as militarized as Rome. So political conflicts do not tend, here in Europe at least, to become mirrored by the battle of real armies. So I would rather think about riots in this, everywhere between whole parts or sections of big European towns becoming totally ungovernable, of political control, only concentrating on some selected cores of cities, of the territory, of assuming only, I would say, control over industrial facilities, airports, rich people's neighborhoods, and that the rest of the geographical map will still continue to exist, but that it will be rather governed by clans, by religious groups, by paramilitary formations who will more and more get into conflict. So that at the end there will be such a situation that people will welcome the rise either of a populist leader through military forces, for example, to the head of government, or a inner reconstruction of the European Union in a more populist and more authoritarian way. The result would be more or less the same. Either there will be a populist revolution reshaping the European Union, or the European Union itself will become more and more forced or obliged to integrate more plebiscitary, more populist features in its appearance. And then we will have a new state which will impose order, law, tradition, or some kind of reinvented tradition by the force of arms, which will assure also, as I said, order and security. But the price will be, of course, freedom, will be liberty, will be democracy, and this kind of new, I would say, new construction of a new European identity, which will be more or less parallel with the new invention of Romanity under Augustus, will be quite artificially, so that will be people won't really believe in it. They will act accordingly, of course, which will stabilize the society, but it will not really be rooted in the inner self of people. There will be also a return of religion, of Christianity, as Augustus also tried to base parts of his legitimacy on a reinvention of Roman religion, but that doesn't mean that people will become really Christian again. It will become some kind of state religion with much pomp and exteriority, but it won't really mean that there will be a huge spiritual revolution. And the result will not necessarily be much better than what we have today, because if you look at Augustus, you will and Trump in some way always already shows in this risk of the combination of extreme richness of the state leader. Augustus at the end is the richest man, of course, of the Roman Empire as an individual, not only as its emperor, but also as an individual, because he owns large parts of the empire. So we will have a leading kind of big brother whose image you will see more or less everywhere on the streets, whom people, at least simple people, will generally adore, because he assures law, order, minimum income, stability, security, who will lead a government of people who are in their great majority extremely rich, also, who will of course present themselves as frugal, as very Spartan in their outlook, but it will be quite false in reality. And the government will present itself as being democratic. There will be elections, of course, as there were also elections in Rome, but without big choices, because candidates will be appointed by the leading elite or by its figurehead. So it will be some kind of European Union, quite resembling what is happening for the moment in China or in Putin's Russia. Something on that model, I would say. Something that may seem, from today's perspective, perhaps even as quite sympathetic to people who are conservative or traditionalists today, but who will be the first one who, when it really arises, will know that it is false in some way. It will assure stability, but it will not be the real thing. History ended in some way.
And in that sense, also for us Dutch people, that's maybe quite an important thing to think about. Do you think 2017 will be a turning point in this whole movement that we are seeing at the moment? Because we have Trump becoming president, we have elections in France,
Brexit,
Germany, Brexit, Holland, general elections in March.
Yeah.
Do you have some ideas about how that will turn out?
It might be possible. It might be possible that 2017 will be a major turning point in European history. That could be. I'm not sure about the outcome. I don't think that in Germany, for example, I don't think that the AfD has any chances of becoming the leading party. That's impossible. But already now to see the huge success it enjoys is already an inner revolution in German history, and in some way also in European history. And even I would say that it doesn't really make a big difference to see if the Front National or the AfD is in power or not, because its simple presence will influence on the long run, at least, how politics are seen. We have seen that at least the political discourse in France is more and more influenced also by the terminology and the issues addressed by the Front National, because they have to keep to their power, so they adopt at least parts of the ideology or the worldview of the Front National only to keep to their power. So even if the Front National at the end fails, it has won in transforming other parties into something not so dissimilar to it, on the one hand, or on the other, if there is some form of cordon sanitaire around parties like the AfD, that will enhance even more its future success, as it will push the traditional parties of forming long-term coalitions for years, even for decades, and the outcome of that will also be a one-party rule. So on the one hand or the other, it will end into unrest and one-party rule. Of course, there might be a difference to the fact to what degree different parties will still be allowed, or if there will be only one party. But already now, I am very often under the impression, if I compare the middle left and the middle right parties, of having in front of me a single party with a left wing and the right wing section, but of being more or less the same party. And so that will be the end. There will be still the label of democracy on our state. There will be elections. There were elections also in Rome, at least on a communal level. But this general idea of political freedom and of influencing immediately through majority votes politics in a direct way, I think, will cease. Or rather, it will be transferred, as it was also in Rome, on another level. Because in Rome, you have to think, for example, that of course there weren't any real elections anymore under the Principate, but still the emperor had to face his population when he went into the theater, into the circus, and he saw if people were applauding or not. He felt if he was appreciated or not. So he adopted himself very clearly to what he thought corresponded more or less to the majority. Exactly as today with opinion polls have replaced political majorities, as majorities are behaving on an everyday basis to polls. So there will not necessarily be a tyranny who does exactly what it wants every day, a concept which has never existed, because even monarchies have to, or even dictatorships have to align in some way to what they think the majority thinks still acceptable. And so I fear that also in our nearer future, such an authoritarian regime may still uphold a democratic facade, such as Augustus uphold the facade of the Roman Republic, but still will impose politics on a much broader basis than today's elite, which is much more an oligarchy than the authoritarian regime I'm fearing on the one hand, because I'm really clinging to my liberty, to my idea of freedom, but which on the other hand seems to be without any real alternative.
Okay, thank you very much.
That's a good point for our listeners to contemplate on.
Thank you.
A lot we talked about,
Yeah.
even a lot more to read about in your book. I read the German version, but I understood that maybe there will be an English version soon.
There are some projects who go in that sense. Yeah, absolutely. I hope there will be one perhaps at the end of this year, beginning of the next year. So that would be great.
Yeah. So to the listener, I can very much recommend to read this book, and I think it was a very nice conversation
Yes,
we had
very
here.
interesting.
Very enlightening, also.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In addition to reading your book.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you very much. And of course, we would like to thank our listeners for listening.